Hey, do you guys want to see a magic trick? Okay, I would like for you to think off the top of your head of an African language. You got it? Okay. Through my magic, I'm going to read your minds. Was your answer Swahili? Okay, now I'm sure a good number of you are a little bit disappointed and were thinking of something else, but I'm equally sure that a good chunk of you, especially those of you outside of Africa, were probably thinking of Swahili as the first idea that popped into your mind when I mentioned African language. Swahili, or more properly known as KiSwahili to refer specifically to the language, is far and away the most visible language in Africa among the non-African public. For example, more than 100 American universities offer courses in KiSwahili, while less than a dozen offer courses in Hausa, despite having a similar number of fluent speakers, while almost every other African language is offered by only a single-digit quantity of American schools. In American movies, whenever a character is from a vague, unnamed place in Africa, they speak Swahili. In the film Mean Girls, the main character is from an unspecified part of Africa, so when she tries to speak an African language to some of her peers to hilarious effect, the language she speaks is KiSwahili. The most financially successful film set in Africa of all time is the animated Disney feature The Lion King. Despite featuring several animals that only live in the country of South Africa, which has practically no KiSwahili-speaking population, the film gives most of the characters KiSwahili names, and famously popularized the KiSwahili phrase Hakuna Matata among the Western public, meaning roughly, take it easy or no worries. The ubiquity of KiSwahili in Western media depictions of Africa has led to a widespread perception among the mainstream Western public that Swahili is a pan-continental language, spoken by everyone in every corner of Africa. One of the most shockingly common experiences that African immigrants to the West share frequently is, upon informing someone that their home country is in the African continent, being asked if they speak or understand Swahili, even if they originate from countries where KiSwahili is largely non-existent. As a slightly peeved Nigerian coworker of mine once told me, quote, a lot of Americans believe that Africa is a single country, and that this country of Africa speaks Swahili as its official language. Now, the lay people of Western countries, especially my home country of the US, are a pretty easy target for mockery when it comes to ignorance about Africa. But I think that the assumption of KiSwahili as a pan-continental language is actually pretty forgivable as far as stereotypes go. While the language is only widely spoken in a handful of countries in East Africa, and historically had an even smaller geographic range than that, the widespread perception of KiSwahili as the language of Africa can be largely credited to the work of Tanzanian leaders in the mid to late 20th century. Tanzania, the population with the largest KiSwahili-speaking population in the world, had implemented a widespread effort to try to remove one of the most pronounced and enduring legacies of colonialism still widespread throughout the continent. Throughout the mid-20th century, while many African nations had become independent, ostensibly free from colonialism, the legacy of colonialism remained omnipresent in every conversation through the widespread use of European languages as national lingua franca. The government of Tanzania was one of the first nations to push back against this practice, and arguably the most successful. Tanzania was a linguistically diverse country, but KiSwahili, spoken primarily along the coast, was the most widely spoken language. Over time, the government started to gradually phase out the use of English in schools, or at least only teaching it as a foreign language, in favor of using KiSwahili as the main language of instruction. The government simultaneously encouraged the creation of poetry, films, and literature in KiSwahili, while many globally significant works of literature were translated into KiSwahili for the first time. The policy mostly succeeded. While English is still certainly widely spoken in some of Tanzania, KiSwahili has become the country's primary lingua franca. And Tanzania's success encouraged many other countries nearby to push back against colonial cultural influence through the use of KiSwahili. Similar policies were also undertaken in neighboring Kenya. Another country with a much lower native KiSwahili speaking population, but a still pretty substantial number. These efforts to use KiSwahili as not just an alternative to English and other colonial languages, but also as a powerful cultural symbol unique to Africa, would transform KiSwahili into far more than just an ordinary language, but to a symbol of cultural anti-colonialism. Soon, this same trend would take form abroad. The governments of Tanzania and Kenya had invested great amounts of capital and elbow grease into spreading the language within their own country, which meant that out of any African language, KiSwahili had far and away the greatest availability of educational resources. Other nearby countries, even those with much smaller native KiSwahili-speaking populations like Uganda and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, began to invest in spreading the language to their populations. Meanwhile, across the ocean, the emerging Black Power movement in the United States was, for the first time, motivating many African Americans to invest their own time and energy into learning more and connecting with their African heritage. This desire to connect with the continent led a small but passionate portion of the African American community to begin learning KiSwahili as a second language. Kwanzaa, a new holiday created by African Americans to commemorate and celebrate African American heritage and culture, named its key events and principles from KiSwahili. Meanwhile, KiSwahili names like Jabari, Amani, Kijana, and more became very popular names for Black American children. Now, this movement hit a peak in the 1960s and 70s and has been in a slow decline ever since, with Kwanzaa becoming an increasingly unpracticed holiday, with KiSwahili being spoken almost entirely by East African immigrants in America, and KiSwahili names becoming less and less common with each passing year. But the popularity of KiSwahili among the Black Power movement of the 20th century was what cemented the language's status as a name synonymous with Africa to the American public. Of course, the language found much greater staying power within East and Central Africa, and still to this day functions as the de facto lingua franca in several countries, despite the vast majority of its speakers knowing the language as a second language. But while the language of KiSwahili has become iconic and widespread, often lost in the discussions of the language are the people from whom the language originated. The Swahili language, KiSwahili, comes from the Swahili people, the Waswahili. Would it surprise you to learn that KiSwahili, a language with over 90 million speakers today, originated from a people who barely number over 1 million? That in the country with the largest Waswahili population, that they number less than 2% of the population? It begs the question of how a culture that was so small in number became so incredibly influential. This fascinating culture and people are interesting for far more than just their language, which has spread far and wide. In addition to becoming culturally synonymous with the continent, the Waswahili built a sophisticated civilization of their own, which designed some of the world's most unique urban centers, explored the vast Indian Ocean, and created multiple politically complex polities, whether in the form of city-states or larger kingdoms. They were a literate society who wrote down historical records and poetry, and minted their own coins. And in terms of scale and significance, one Swahili kingdom would rise to dwarf the others as a giant in East African history. A kingdom that from a small island capital would extend to unrivaled heights in terms of cultural, economic, and political influence. It was the first thalassocracy in a region that would one day become famous for its maritime prowess, with its unique coins appearing in coffers as far afield as China, Indonesia, and even Australia. And even as its once glorious capital city lies in ruin, the unique architecture within it continues to inspire awe and wonder even as we speak. Today we are going to begin an exploration of our own, as we explore the wondrous history of the Sultanate of Kilwa. Season 6, Episode 1, The Swahili Coast. It's profoundly ironic that for a word which has become inextricably linked with the idea of Africanness, that the word Swahili itself almost certainly has some origins outside of the continent. The name Swahili can be traced pretty confidently to the Arabic word Sawahil, meaning coasts. And much like how someone from Iraq is Iraqi, or someone from Yemen is Yemeni, someone from the coasts, Sawahil, is Swahili. Of course, the Waswahili did not call themselves the Waswahili for most of history, but from the perspective of others, it was this name, Swahili, that became ubiquitous. And yes, this means that we have another entry to add to the list of humorously redundant English names for African geographic features. We've already seen the Sahara Desert, or Desert, Lake Chad, or Lake, and now we can add Swahili Coast, or People of the Coast's Coast, to the list. Similarly to the former cases, though, if you interpret these phrases poetically, these tautologies are accidentally quite appropriate. Much like how Sahara Desert could be seen as saying it's the desert of deserts, you could argue similarly that the Swahili coast, in the context of East African history, was the coast of coasts, a place where the ideas of coastal life, with its cosmopolitanism, commercialism, and spirit of exploration, were embodied better here than anywhere else. Now, the quote-unquote Swahili coast is a difficult-to-pin-down construction, a cultural anachronism, a shorthand convenient for archaeologists, anthropologists, and historians, rather than a term of identification that anyone would have used before relatively recent times. It's also a construct defined by the always slippery concept of culture, rather than well-defined and widely accepted political frontiers or objective, unmovable geographic features. Where is the Swahili coast? Well, it's the coast where the Swahili live. For this reason, it's hard to say exactly where the Swahili coast begins or ends, as such a question rapidly devolves into identifying a traditional ethnic homeland, and from there, into contested claims mired in modern ethno-nationalism. To further add to the muddiness, these ethnic divides are often loosely defined, anachronistic, and contested. Many of the people who outsiders might call Waswahili do not necessarily view themselves as part of that same umbrella, but rather as just a culturally similar but distinct group. With all that qualified, I prefer to adopt a fairly conservative definition of the region. The Swahili coast refers to the regions that served as the main homeland of the ancestors of the Waswahili, or places along the coast where their culture became indisputably dominant. I'd say this definition best fits the context of this series, but I could totally understand if you prefer a different one. Using this conservative definition, we can somewhat confidently place the Swahili coast as a long stretch of coastal land, penetrating approximately 50 to 100 kilometers into the interior, and stretching north to south along the coast, from roughly modern-day northern coastal Kenya, across Tanzania, and down to central Mozambique, incorporating various small islands that lay off the coast. But again, this is vague. If you're trying to picture this stretch of land as a map in your head, it would probably be appropriate to make sure that the edges of the section are met not with solid, but dotted lines. While the Swahili coast is a socio-historic term, one that theoretically could stretch geographically across any number of diverse climate zones, this vague stretch of coastline is surprisingly homogeneous in terms of physical climate. The entirety of the Swahili coast, with few exceptions, would be classified as tropical savanna. But don't let that fool you into picturing a prototypical African savanna of rolling yellow grasslands. No, you'll have to go a little further inland for that, with perhaps the most famous savanna in the world, the ever-iconic Serengeti National Park, being located about 600 kilometers inland from its closest point to the Swahili coast. But helpfully, we can picture a national park if you'd like a mental image of the natural landscape of the Swahili coast. Saadani National Park, a mosaic of scenic plains covered in low-growing grass, as well as fairly thick tropical forests of banana, palm, and other trees, disappearing into a pearl white sand beach as you approach the closest reaches of the coastline. But not every shoreline in the region is so rigidly divided between forest and beach. One of the most significant landscape-defining features of the East African coast, as well as one that had played a pretty sizable role in the shaping of the history of its people, are the breathtaking clusters of mangroves that blur the line between forest and beach. These mangrove forests are a true wonder in their own right, one that afforded a number of unique environmental perks that influence the pattern of human history in the region. Mangrove trees thrive in brackish estuaries and coastal areas with freshwater runoff, and due to their sheltering nature and bacteria that thrive in their roots, become especially replete with fish, crabs, snails, and other marine animals, as well as, of course, birds and mammals which feed on this seafood. They also provide useful and accessible building materials, and perhaps most usefully to the people who live there, provide crucial protection from natural disasters. Mangrove forests can act as immensely effective barriers against tropical storms, disperse approaching tsunamis, as well as absorbing much of the brunt of coastal flooding and reducing the erosion they cause. Between the easy access to building materials, their close proximity to the world's most important global maritime highway, the ocean, as well as protection from some of the hazards associated with living on the shore, the mangrove forests were tremendous real estate for city building. But there is one geographic feature which would come to influence the development of life and history on the Swahili coast far more than any other. This would, of course, be the winds of the Indian Ocean. In fact, when it comes to East African history, the significance of the Indian Ocean system of winds is so crucial and unavoidable that we've already talked about them in depth multiple times on this podcast before, in our seasons on Madagascar and Aksum. However, since it will play such an important role in this season too, it certainly bears reiteration. The current of the open Indian Ocean is primarily defined by an enormous elliptical gyre, in which currents flow all the way from East Africa, across the sea, to Indonesia, turn course, and then make a return journey to East Africa. If skilled sailors prepared adequately for the long journey, this current functioned as a 7,500 kilometer long transoceanic highway between East Africa and Southeast Asia. While seasonal winds could sometimes reverse the current order, these changes were predictable and relatively simple for sailors to adjust to. But in terms of the maritime economics of East Africa, the Indian Ocean gyre was still arguably just a minor piece of the puzzle. The more impactful feature, you could argue, for the Swahili coast was the system of monsoon winds which blew seasonably between East Africa and India. In winter, these winds from the western Indian Ocean blew south, allowing skilled sailors from India to use the ships to propel them to East Africa. In the summer, of course, the winds reverse, permitting these Indian merchants a smooth return journey or giving East African merchants a smooth journey of departure. While this route only functioned as a seasonally swapping one-way street, its regular and predictable winds permitted sailors to plan their journeys well in advance. Even better, the easily accessible route to India also happened to bring sailors within a short distance of the Persian Gulf, ensuring ease of access between East Africa and not only India, but also to the Arabian Peninsula, Iran, and Mesopotamia. If you're listening to this show and already have a cursory knowledge of the history of the Swahili coast, then you're already likely aware of how enormously impactful the route between the Swahili coast and these Middle Eastern destinations will become. But almost as important as the region's crucial maritime trade routes was its access to overland trade with the interior of the African continent. While the lands immediately beyond the Swahili coast were largely rustic and low population density, a prolonged overland trip could eventually lead to the nearest large inland population centers, the African Great Lakes region. This geographic stretch of lakes, including such famous large bodies as Lake Victoria, Lake Malawi, and Lake Tanganyika, as well as several smaller but still substantial freshwater lakes, served as the home of one of Africa's largest inland population centers. Within this region would arise several influential kingdoms and societies, and would prove to be an important inland destination for Swahili merchants. Interestingly enough, these lakes are also a hotspot for biodiversity, with many of the world's most fascinating and popular freshwater fish species calling the Great Lakes of Africa home. If you'd like to learn more about the history of the pet trade in East Africa, and how fish from the Great Lakes took over aquariums around the world, then you should go to our Patreon and check out our newest premium episode that focuses on the spread of East African kitchlids around the world. You can find that episode and many others at patreon.com/historyofafrica, and for those of you already supporting the show, a heartfelt thank you. Now, of course, this aquatic pet trade was presumably non-existent in the ancient and medieval history of the regions, but several other commercial links between the Swahili coast and the Great Lakes would become notable. Overland routes between the Great Lakes region and the Swahili coast would play an enormous role in the development of both areas. Another inland region that would play an extensive role in the history of the Swahili coast is the Zambezi River Valley. Another center of highly populated, urbanized civilization, contacts between the Swahili coast and the civilizations of the Zambezi Valley would become even more pronounced in the region's early history, acting as the door through which Central African commodities would reach the world. We'll be talking a lot more about these connections as the season continues. But as a result of its key location along the juncture of these two crucial maritime trade routes and a prominent series of overland trade routes, the Swahili coast would gradually gain fame worldwide as an essential stop for those interested in the region's system of trade. Join us in our next episode as we explore the ancient history of the Swahili coast, with the rise of the region's earliest city-state and possibly the very birth of Swahili history itself. Thank you for listening to the History of Africa podcast. If you like our show, then we would greatly appreciate if you could help support the show and our project of freely available online history education. You can do this by supporting us at patreon.com/historyofafrica, providing us a rating or review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or iTunes, or by sharing the podcast with anyone who you think might enjoy learning about African history. This episode is brought to you by our supporters on Patreon, including Naomi Kanakia, Ayofagbamie, Dimitri, Alexander Travis, BB Milliam, Conrad Schwenke, Pascal Mokocha, Joe Maxwell, Nkechi Nwambodike, Kwajo Mankwa, Douglas Harder and Sherry Robinson, Craig Bolton, Samuel Badeau, Rassan Virgiani, Ni T, Kitty, Matt T, Tariq Beetleman, Kelvin J. Norris, Ellen Fisher, Jessica, Switson Blair, and Yannick Bolnett, among others. Thank you all for supporting the show. It really, 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 really means a lot.